Are you ready to make your final push for the fantasy football playoffs and get yourself a fantasy football championship in 2023? Well, we got a top 5 running back who just returned from injury that we need to talk about, plus many more players you do not want to miss. Let's go ahead and get into Week 13 Risers of the Week. What up and welcome to Rival Fantasy Week 13 Risers episode. I'm Neil Maligno, and the goal of this episode is to strictly talk about the players whose fantasy football stock is on the rise. The players discussed on this episode may be good trade targets for you if the trade window is still open, waiver wire ads, must starts, and more. Now, I keep these episodes quick hitting. If you want longer interactive content, subscribe to the channel, join our weekly live episodes, including our Sunday Start State Advice live stream that kicks off at 11:30 a.m. Drop your questions in the comments because no question goes unanswered here at Rival Fantasy. Jordan Love finished as the QB5 in Week 12, having his best fantasy week of the entire season. Jordan Love now has back-to-back weeks without throwing an interception and has also tied his highest rushing yard game of the season. Love seems to be getting in better rhythm with his playmakers as Watson and Reed are starting to score touchdowns on a weekly basis. Expect less down weeks rest of the way. Jordan Love is a top 10 quarterback in fantasy football scoring and has some really good matchups upcoming. He is a certified riser in fantasy. The Broncos have now won 5 games straight, putting eyes back on quarterback Russell Wilson, who lost some attention in fantasy when the Broncos were getting smacked each week. The funny thing is, Russell's actually been pretty consistent all season long, and now that the Broncos are winning, isn't actually having better fantasy weeks. Wilson had 2 20-plus point performances in the first 4 weeks of the season and hasn't had one since. The reason Russell Wilson is a riser is in the hopes that the Broncos are improving, so there should be more room for fantasy value to increase as well. So how good has Kyren Williams been in the 2023 fantasy football season? He's only played in 7 games this season, yet he's still the RB16 in PPR scoring. After last playing in Week 6, Kyren decided he was going to outscore the entire NFL in fantasy in Week 12, except for Buffalo Bills quarterback Josh Allen, who scored 2 more fantasy points. The Rams get him involved at all levels, and Kyren produced through both the ground game and the passing game. With all that being said, Kyren is a riser because we are legit talking about a player who is now a top 5 player at his position rest of the season. Bijan Robinson started his rookie season on fire, had a couple up and down weeks, then things got really weird with the Atlanta Falcons, and now he's back having high-end weeks. I believe the coaches in Atlanta now know they can't do any more of this nonsense with Bijan. Since they figured that out, it's going to be great for him. Bijan has all the talent in the world and is easily one of the better backs in football. Now that the Falcons are done playing these childish games, Bijan is a riser in fantasy. The Chiefs rookie wide receiver Rashee Rice is currently the wide receiver number 35 in PPR scoring, and in Week 12, he actually had his best week by far this season versus the Raiders. Rice pulled off 8 receptions, 107 yards, and 1 touchdown, finishing with 24.7 fantasy points. Now, Rice had the second most targets on the Chiefs offense, right behind Travis Kelce, and he has double the fantasy points as the next closest wide receiver on the team. He's now Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes' most trusted target outside of Kelce, and that matters in a big way. Green Bay Packers wide receiver Christian Watson is coming off back-to-back weeks with touchdowns, and in Week 12, he had the most receptions in a game since his return. Watson finished as the wide receiver 13 in Week 12, having his best week of the season by far with 20.4 fantasy points. Watson and his teammates Dobbs and Reed have all had 2 or more touchdowns in the last 3 weeks, and that's happening through improved quarterback play and good health, making Watson a riser rest of season. Rams tight end Tyler Higbee had his best game of the season in Week 12 with 5 receptions, 29 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Higbee finished the week with just under 20 fantasy points, which is actually his first double-digit fantasy points game since Week 4. The Rams can use all the help they can get with Cooper Kupp struggling, so Higbee and Kyren flourishing in Week 12 was a welcome sign for the Rams and fantasy managers. Higbee may still be a hit-or-miss tight end, but it's good to see that he still has some of those hits left in the tank for fantasy. Pat Freiermuth has only played in 6 games this season, and Week 12 was the only week he scored more than 15 fantasy points this season. Now, is it a coincidence that the Steelers fired their offensive coordinator and Pat had his best week of the season? I think not. Pat had 11 targets from quarterback Kenny Pickett in Week 12, and I don't anticipate that to dwindle back down to a couple targets in Week 13. Look for Pat to rise up the tight end leaderboard for the rest of the season. When the Raiders fired Josh McDaniels and then demoted Jimmy G to backup, fantasy managers backed off of wide receiver Jakobi Meyers. In Week 12, rookie quarterback Aiden O'Connell proved that the concern for the Raiders offense isn't as bad as they originally thought. Meyers had 6 receptions for 79 yards and a touchdown, finishing with a top 15 week at wide receiver. The rest of the season matchup for the Raiders are nice, so Meyers can be trusted to produce in fantasy and is a riser rest of season. Now, if you want more fantasy football advice from Rival Fantasy Sports, subscribe to the channel now for new content, including our weekly Start Sit live show every Sunday at 11:30 a.m. You can follow us on social for all the latest app updates, promos, and latest fantasy football news at Rival Fantasy on Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok. And of course, go check out rivalfantasy.com or download the Rival Fantasy app today. Play challenges, bingo, have your season-long leagues, NFL, MLB, NBA. It's all available to you. Rivalfantasy.com or go download the app now in your app store, Rival Fantasy Sports.